I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Joi Ito. Many of you may actually know Joi Ito as the CEO of Creative Commons, an online vehicle that allows artists to have the power to use their copyrights in order to share their works freely. I know that we all care about the proliferation of artistic expression, so he is definitely a man after our own hearts. What you may not know is that beyond fighting for unfettered creative expression and production, he is a venture capitalist. In preparing to meet and introduce Joi, I read his blogs and subscribed to his tweets. I don't know if you know that, which were very interesting. And what I was most fascinated by in what he wrote and tweeted was being able to glimpse the world of a venture capitalist, living in Dubai, scuba diving, and traveling the world, for instance, flying to Ireland to check out something called an approximator developed by a group called HyperTiny. From the perspective of a grant maker, alas, I must admit, his world of dot-coms and technological innovations measured in days and not years, and startups seems so foreign to grant-making culture and practices. Yet he is that rare person who knows the language and culture of both worlds, of fast-paced dot-coms and the slower pace of nonprofits. Besides Creative Commons, he is also a board member of the Mozilla Foundation. He comes to us today to talk about the connections he sees between the concepts and tools used by internet developers and traditional grant-making practices. Essentially, being an ambassador from a different world to expand our imagination of what is possible in our own world. Joi, I know you've logged 335,000 miles of travel based on your online counter, and we are delighted that you have traveled 7,000 more to speak to us today. Everyone, please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Joi Ito.
Thank you, and give me 1 second while I get my technology sorted out. That should work. Actually, it was interesting serendipity because last week I was in Washington, D.C. to talk to a bunch of different people there, but I remembered that Joan Shigekawa had moved to NEA, and she said to look her up, and I went and visited her in her fancy new digs, and got to talk to her. And then I remembered that I met Joan, I think 15 years ago. I was on the jury of the Ars Electronica, pre-Ars Electronica, which is a really interesting festival if you don't know about it, but it's in Linz, Austria. And a couple of unique factors is they always try to be at the cutting edge of new types of technology. So they really pioneered the field of computer graphics as a art form, and they pioneered media art. And I was on the first jury of the Internet committee, which was trying to define art of the Internet. And as with all these art fields in the early days of this technology, we give the awards to people who themselves don't think they're artists. So the early computer graphics people were things like scientific visualization and NASA images and what happens, and no one had prepped me on this. I wasn't prepared for it. But what happens is the art community all over Europe and globally, and even Joan was there, so it's an international conference. I also chaired the forum where we talk about things, and I had never been exposed to art. I was a tech guy, but since I knew a lot about the internet, the jury was comprised of artists and a variety of people, and we had to sit around and define what is internet art. And the interesting thing is that the conversation got to, well, we were giving awards to things like Linux and digital cache and things that obviously weren't art from the perspective of typical art people. And what I found was there was a huge split. There was a group of people who believed that art, especially in Europe, meant the people who pushed the limits of the imagination of the engineers. And they were the ones that were sort of the people we looked to break these models that these engineers were making, and it was the artists who were going to be the entrepreneurs, and especially in Europe, I think they looked to the artists for innovation. And the fine arts community would look at us talking about art and say, well, you don't know what art is. That's not art. That's something else. That's design. That's craft. And I would have these long arguments with these very illustrious artists. And I said, well, they told me I could talk about art, and I'm here talking about art. And at the end of this rather treacherous forum discussion, Joan came up to me and said, I'm from the Rockefeller Foundation. I think it's fine that you talk about art. And she really empowered me because here are all these sort of kind of, artists sort of riffraff. And then the first grant maker in art I'd ever met in my whole life said I was okay. And so that actually sort of launched me into this career, and I participated on the jury of the Ars Electronica for probably about 10 years. And I didn't realize the impact that that had actually in many universities across Europe. The criteria that we created for art in internet became the criteria for a lot of the universities to set their program, and that was also what I realized, sort of what grant makers do in a way, which is when you set the criteria, when you create these grants, it's this kind of secondary amplification effect that you have on creating programs in universities and changing the way that students work. And in Europe, in particular, what I found was that by creating criteria that had social benefit, things like community, but things from the art community, we were able to create a kind of community of artists that work together with business people that work together with the technical people. And as a venture capitalist, an interesting thing is actually the most successful company I've ever invested in was founded by some artists at Ars Electronica. They were some artists who were interested in the future of music. They created a website called Last.fm, and it was a collaborative filtering site that sort of basically took the music that you listened to on your iPod and tried to find other people like you, and eventually CBS bought it for hundreds of millions of dollars. But the neat thing for me was that ever since then, especially in Europe, I find that some of the best internet entrepreneurs come from the arts background. And what's interesting also is that there's a parallel with, as Creative Commons, we also work in education. And there's kind of formal education and informal education. And there's, I think, a parallel with the kind of fine arts and formal art and some of the informal art. And I still have a hard time, especially in Japan, where I'm from. We have a very sort of strong, formal, sort of fine arts community. And I'm often called in by these arts communities and the government communities and asked, how can we be more successful? And it's always the same kind of thing. Well, you're so exclusive, and I hate to use the word snob, but you don't really, and the great thing about Linz, Austria, and this Ars Electronica is the event is open to the public. And about 150,000 people, about half the town, comes to the event that they have, which is a big, huge concert on the Danube River. And this whole participatory nature of Ars Electronica is also really amazing. But anyway, I was thinking about that as I was preparing my talk, and the similarity that we have with internet and education, and some of the things I want to tie to, and I wanted to put this in your mind before I sort of went off on this huge tangent I'm about to go on, is that in the old days, before the internet, so that's not that old because I remember them, the cost of distributing content and connecting people, and the cost of convening. So if you think about a university, so I'll use the university metaphor, but it's similar with a gallery or a museum. The cost of sharing information, the cost of creating the information or the content, and the cost of convening people to have meetings, to research, to think, all these cost a lot of money in the old days. Now with the internet, the cost of disseminating information, the cost of collaborating, the cost of connecting people, of course you have to have face-to-face, you have to have physical things. That's the ultimate value. But there's a bunch of what universities used to do and a bunch of what museums used to do that could be done at a much lower cost. And in the old days, I think if you think in terms of education as well, what you did was you said, okay, well, we could only give this sort of value to a limited number of people because we have a physical space, we've got to fly them in. So you had to be very careful about who you gave this scarce resource to. And so you created this ivory tower, you created the accreditation process, and you picked the best and brightest kids to invest all your money into so that they could carry the torch forward and education would continue. But I think this was based on a kind of scarcity that existed that doesn't exist in the same way anymore. And I also find that in art, and I don't know a lot about art, I'll add that caveat, and I'd love to hear more about this, but that I also believe that that scarcity in many areas has diminished, but that a lot of our institutions still are based on a notion of scarcity and a notion of protecting access in order to retain quality, in order to retain the kinds of things that we need.